he's really he's shameless in intellectual argument. He's absolutely without character, a moral foundation, or even intellectual substance.
Welcome back to the Getting Lit podcast. Last episode, we talked about John Crowley's Little Big, the fourth in our series. That'll be continuing in the next months or so until we get to book 6, and John will be joining me for that. But this episode is a bit of like a monologue one. I wanted to go into something that was on my mind recently. So I recently started reading, well, I say reading, but via audiobook more so, which I think counts as reading. When you're in the business of doing a literature podcast, you actually do have to utilize audiobooks. So I use audiobooks a lot of the time, sort of sometimes for the same book that I'm reading for an episode, or sometimes like I'll change between them. But then sometimes I'll also just read one via an audiobook versus read one on the page. That usually depends on the type of book it is. For instance, I wouldn't read something like, I don't know, I recently started Donna Tartt's The Secret History. I wouldn't read something like that in audiobook, a really meaty sort of a literary quote unquote book. But I would read like sort of more your pot boilers and your more commercial stuff via audiobook. That being said, I was recently returning to a book that I'd read like years ago for a Victorian literature class, which was probably my favorite Charles Dickens book, which is Our Mutual Friend. It's a great book. It's sort of like a satirical novel, but it's like a lot of Dickens stuff has that satirical edge, but it is a sort of rambling, kind of sprawling London story, which I really love, like multiple characters and lots of sort of different kinds of characters as well, men, women, like different classes, all that sort of stuff that Dickens was so great at. And it occurred to me as well, like it'd been so long since I'd read something this old, because a lot of the work that we've looked at on the podcast has been pretty newish, like 20th century. But Dickens got me thinking about a very old kind of stylistic thing, which isn't really employed anymore. And I wanted to sort of talk about it, because one of the things that I think is worth talking about, because it links into a lot of stuff that concerns us here at the podcast, is we do talk about style sometimes, and we talk about how what something is about is kind of inextricable from how it's told. I like to focus on that, like style and shit like that. But this one was really interesting to me because it employs what Dickens does employ pretty much throughout all of his books, which is he writes in the third person, but in particular the omniscient third person. So I'm gathering that most people listening to this know what third person is. If you don't, like, first person is when we say I, me, mine in our book. So if you're reading a book and it's more it's sort of more memoiristic, or like it's telling a story from one person's point of view, that's your first person. And your third person is the more distant, respectable kind of style, I guess you would say, where the narrator sort of stands apart from the tales that they're telling. So that's usually, third person is usually the viewpoint or perspective that's most commonly used in things like fairy tales and jokes. And it's also used, pretty heavily in a lot of classic novels, though not all of them. Um, the thing about third person now, today, though, is that pretty much exclusively the third person is used in a way where it's used in a form which is called third person limited. Okay. And this is where the story is told from the third person. So we're not talking about I, me, mine. They're talking about she, her, hers, he, him, his. Like they're referring to other people within the story rather than the person's immediate experience of the story. But it's usually filtered through one or two characters. So in this approach, you get that third person style, that kind of distant style that's like just laying it all out for you, but we're really focused on one character's journey. It's almost like in a video game that we're in the third person's perspective, the camera over the shoulder thing. We're not quite in that like, immediate first person thing, like in a first person shooter or something like that. We're more sort of, we're close, but we're not in it, So this is, this is very, very widely used in modern fiction, but third person used to be used very much in the way that Dickens used it, which was it gave you a sense of omniscience, like that you could, as the author, and indeed as the reader as well, to some extent, kind of be almost like the god of the story, right? So this sort of you're distant, you're away from the events of the story, and it's not so much that you're away; it's more that you're able to oversee it. So that's what the third person omniscient kind of style is. And I'll read you like the first passage as well from our mutual friend in a second, which kind of gives you a sense of this. But yeah, it's really funny as well because in the 19th century, first person was less of a thing. It's particularly in fiction like novels. You even had some people like Henry James, who I love and who is like an immaculate short story writer. I've talked about his work before on, I think we did a Halloween episode. Yeah, last year we did a Halloween episode on The Turn of the Screw, which is an exquisite short story. Like Henry James just has this command of language where he can write really long, rambling sentences, but they're just like, you don't want them to stop. They're never boring or plotting, and so much is going on within them. But he writes in those kind of shorter forms. He writes in first person perspective. But for longer stories, he had very strong opinions on not using first person perspective, like I's and me's and that. He said that doing that for longer stories was base and primitive. So he pretty much advocated for the more versatile options that third person kind of gave you. And I mean, if you're the sort of writer that's like Dickens, and you want to explore a vast world, like obviously third person omniscient is going to free the writer up in a lot more ways than first person or third person limited. So on a grand scale, the narrator has basically access to every person at every place that they can imagine or want to imagine, and they can do it from sort of multiple angles. The great thing about Dickens, for example, is though it is a little bit like you have to get used to the style of it and it can be a little bit stuffy for modern readers. The great thing is that he will go, behind the dusty cupboard, look under the chest of drawers. Like he'll just go in all these nooks and crannies that you just pretty much can't do in third person limited if the character is not there, So I just want to read it's quite a long couple of paragraphs from the first page of Our Mutual Friend. And it gives you a sense of what the difference is between third person that you may have read in like some commercial fiction, more recent fiction now, with that kind of very limited scope, and third person omniscient with that more expansive scope. And then I'm going to talk about like why we don't do this anymore. So, by the way, he writes in really long sentences. So I'm gonna like, and I haven't really practiced this. So if I'm running out of breath, that's why. It's not because I'm having a heart attack or something like that. So, okay. So this is chapter 1. It's called On the Lookout of Our Mutual Friend. In these times of ours, though concerning the exact year, there is no need to be precise, a boat of dirty and disreputable appearance with 2 figures in it floated on the Thames between Southwark Bridge, which is made of iron, and London Bridge, which is of stone, as an autumn evening was closing in. The figures in this boat were those of a strong man with ragged, grizzled hair and a sun-browned face, and a dark girl of 19 or 20, sufficiently like him to be recognizable as his daughter. The girl rowed, pulling a pair of sculls very easily. The man with the rudder line slack in his hands and his hands loose in his waistband kept an eager lookout. He had no net, hook, or line, and he could not be a fisherman. His boat had no cushion for a sitter, no paint, no inscription, no appliance beyond a rusty boat hook and a coil of rope, and he could not be a waterman. His boat was too crazy and too small to take in cargo for delivery, and he could not be a lighterman or river carrier. There was no clue to what he looked for, but he looked for something, with a most intent and searching gaze. The tide, which had turned an hour before, was running down, and his eyes watched every little race and eddy in its broad sweep, as the boat made slight headway against it, or drove stern foremost before it, according as he directed his daughter by a movement of his head. She watched his face as earnestly as he watched the river, but in the intensity of her look there was a touch of dread or horror. Allied to the bottom of the river rather than the surface, by reason of the slime and ooze with which it was covered, and its sodden state, the boat and the 2 figures in it obviously were doing something that they often did, and were seeking what they often sought. Half savage, as the man showed, with no covering on his matted head, with his brown arms bare to between the elbow and the shoulder, with the loose knot of a loose kerchief lying low on his bare breast in a wilderness of beard and whisker, with such dress as he wore seeming to be made out of the mud that begrimed his boat, still there was a business-like usage in his steady gaze. So with every lithe action of the girl, with every turn of her wrist, perhaps most of all with her look of dread or horror, they were things of usage. "Keep her out, Lizzie. Tide runs strong here. Keep her well afore the sweep of it." Trusting to the girl's skill and making no use of the rudder, he eyed the coming tide with an absorbed attention. So the girl eyed him. But it happened now that a slant of light from the setting sun glanced into the bottom of the boat, and, touching a rotten stain there which bore some resemblance to the outline of a muffled human form, coloured it as though with diluted blood. This caught the girl's eye, and she shivered. So yeah, I just love that opening. It's like really evocative and very kind of sort of typical of Dickens' way of getting you into a book and getting you sort of situated in the story. But the way he does that is not from either the man's perspective or his daughter's perspective, right? We don't know who these figures are, and we're very remote from them, but we can tell things about them from this distance. And there's something fun to sort of unraveling the mystery there about what's going on. So I'm not trying to turn this into a creative writing class or anything like that, but like that, this sort of mystique that like this more omniscient style has, because we're not over the shoulder like in the third person camera in a video game or something like that. It's more like the narrator is like looking on, but the narrator is almost like God because they can kind of zoom out and zoom in as they wish, basically. So this is a style or perspective or voice that is very uncommon now. And so most contemporary literature, and this goes for like your more literary stuff, and it also goes for your more kind of commercial stuff like crime, science fiction, horror, all that sort of stuff. Most of it is either from the first person perspective, i.e., like I said before, the narrator is the protagonist and uses I and me pronouns, or it's from the third person, so he, she, they, like we were talking about just before. But with the third person, like I said, it's a very limited form of it. So, but third person omniscient has become extremely marginal. And I was just wondering why while I was reading this book or listening to it on the audiobook, as the case may be. I mean, you could make the argument, for example, that first person perspective and third person limited, which is kind of first person in disguise, I would argue, um, that they seem to reign because they strongly correlate to a kind of, you know, liberal standpoint mania that we have across all our culture now. It's all about the self and self-expression and all this sort of stuff. You only really get something close to an omniscient third voice when the work has multiple perspectives. And I think that's usually more of an epiphenomenon rather than the point of it itself, which I'll talk about in a second. Yeah, so third person omniscient in particular, I think it's way better in a way. I'm not saying I have preference one or the other. I'm just saying its advantages are that you have this like amazing scope, but also this amazing depth and breadth. So it's almost three-dimensional in the way that it kind of works. You can burrow down or sweep across an epoch or a life world or something like that, but you're just not going to get this kind of scope through something like first or a very limited third, because it's limited for a reason. You don't want that scope. You want that focus with those styles. And that's like I'm saying, I'm not preferencing one or the other, right? So like inner life is all really well and good, like especially if you're doing it, whether you're doing it in third or first. But I think a lot of the times we need to, well, I don't think a lot of the time, but I think that we could do with getting out of the self more often than not. And that's not even just ourselves, but like this focus on the self, which I know is a funny thing to say when you read a book and you want to know about a character. That is, a character needs to be a kind of self in a way to be fully realized. So first person has its joys, of course, and I don't think it's less or more sophisticated, but it's sort of different. You can get a really sophisticated use of third person, like when you explore things like truth and stuff like that, when you play with things like unreliable narrators and things like that, which, like I've said before, is always like when people go on and on about unreliable narration, it kind of becomes a little bit boring and like a maths exercise. But, I think that's where it's most interesting. Like we explored that in the Book of the New Sun series that I did with the Agitator Boys, which was fun. So I think with my like bugbear about there being no omniscience in third person anymore, I think that is perhaps partially responsible for why so few novels that are written these days, uh, they never kind of reach these sort of heights of the sublime, right? So they're always aiming for sort of the small or the marginal, the beautiful sentence, the precise third person limited perspective. Like it's all about that precision of like characterization there. And in a way, I think it's too focused on character, that first person, idea and that third person limited, they're too focused on it. Whereas the sublime, the sublime is about an expansive, overwhelming bigness, Um, and so I think what's really lacking in a lot of modern literature is that bigness, right? We're always focusing on the small, even if you're writing like something, like very outlandish, like a splatterpunk or something like that. If you're focusing on the first person or, a very limited third, you're not getting that sort of sublimity. Now, this might be a little bit too easy, but I think that, with the 19th century and into the 20th century, we saw things like Darwinism and the development of industry and all that sort of shit. And we kind of saw religion eclipsed by science. And arguably, we saw this idea of omniscience implied by the God's eye view of the world. We saw that this was replaced by a more kind of expansive idea of, quote unquote reality. It's sort of like a pantheistic way of looking at things, I guess. But also atheistic in some cases as well. So then we saw like gradually the kind of realist novel, if you want to call it that, grew to be expansive and had a certain kind of an omniscience, but it was the omniscience of like the universe itself. So the realist novel often had like a range of characters and it nested their stories in sort of great sweeping events of history and science and modernity. So Dickens is a really good example of this, particularly Our Mutual Friend, which I read from earlier. But you can think about things like George Eliot's Middlemarch, really big, fat books like that, the classics of Victorian literature that sort of do that, kind of go over everything in that sort of omniscient scope. So yeah, when we have multiple characters, we do shift to different characters in these kinds of books. But, it's very much not yet quite to the level of limited, third person limited. It doesn't slot us into a pod for a de facto first person. Each character is usually fully realized within their vast social context. But within that social context, there is a possibility of knowledge. And perhaps that possibility is kind of a bit of a form of hubris or something. But it's a hopeful possibility. And I don't think you should write anything if you don't know or want to know something. So I think knowledge is really important. And that was something that I think those big, fat 19th century books really kind of grasped at. As this idea of omniscience and that God's eye view of the world kind of started to fade. But in the 20th century, of course, knowledge gave way to information. And, if you want a definition of knowledge, I would consider it something like judiciously chosen information that is strung together by someone or someones. To produce knowledge, someone smart has to relate information and facts and all of that quantifiable stuff into something cohesive and new. But in the modern era, knowledge became increasingly siloed and data became synonymous with knowledge. So in response to this, what I think happened with a lot of modern literature, and, this reached at obsessive heights in postmodern literature, was a focus not so much on all of this information and facts and figures, but on all of those things in relation to each other, how those things relate to each other and connect. So the postmodern novel, so things like Infinite Jest and White Teeth, they were kind of really all concerned with these relations. And kind of sort of critiqued on that level as well. And I was skipping ahead here from like 19th century to sort of the end of the 20th, but I think it's an important sort of move when it comes to thinking about this sort of omniscient style. But like these postmodern novels, like they were what the critic James Wood called hysterical realism, which I just love that term. And I just wish I could drop it every now and then, but it's not really it's not something that you can drop into conversations because no one has read Infinite Jest, including myself. But I hope to remedy that one day. And so he talks about this in this hilarious review that he wrote. I'll just quote him. He says, "Novels, after all, turn out to be delicate structures in which one story judges the viability, the actuality of another. Yet it's the relatedness of these stories that their writers seem most to cherish and to propose as an absolute value. An endless web is all they need for meaning. Each of these novels is excessively centripetal. The different stories all intertwine and double and triple on themselves. Characters are forever seeing connections and links and plots and paranoid parallels. There is something essentially paranoid about the belief that everything is connected to everything else." End quote. But this need to connect everything only occurs because we live in a post-death of God society where there is no great connector to fill in these dizzying linkages, right? So that's what I think. This is where I think a lot of that, where that omniscient style has gone, why it's sort of withered because of this. I think omniscience is only really appealing to a culture that believes it is possible to transcend subjective experience. And for the most part, I don't believe we live in that culture. Our culture not only believes this is impossible, it also believes it is undesirable. But these so-called hysterical realist books, like, Infinite Jest or White Teeth or whatever, they weren't really works like Moby Dick. When they listed off, when one of the charms of Moby Dick, and I've said this before, is the listing off of endless scientific facts about cetaceans or whales. It gets almost overbearing, but that's one of the reasons why it is the book it is. The difference with the kind of postmodern novel, and to some extent most novels today, is the obsession with quoting or allusion or the act of referencing itself rather than any specific object of knowledge, right? It's more about the connections between knowledge. And to the extent a lot of these kinds of books engage with specific objects of knowledge, it's often European cultural theory. Think French stuff like Foucault or Derrida. But the theories used here are always theories of the self within society. I think it's a tacked on attempt to make smaller stories big, trying to capture or recapture that old essence of the novel with the volume of theoretical musings instead of the breadth of reality. Instead of, contemplating humanity's place in reality, the perception of reality itself is called into question, and questions of perception are always reduced to subjective experience. So ultimately, while these big postmodern tomes certainly have a lot of information, they're not so much about selves in the world as the world of the self. So there's still a possibility, some might say, that you can like reach for something like this kind of uh, huge, big, sprawling novel with things like one example someone might give is the Game of Thrones books or whatever, where you have multiple kind of characters, multiple lands and stuff like that that are talked about, and it's all very detailed and it aims for a sort of scope that something like Dickens might have, but it's very different because it's filtered through a mosaic of perspectives, this book series. I mean, I stopped reading this like years and years ago, but I read them when they first came out. That's how old I am. But it has alternating chapters and they are all in third person, but they are all very extremely close. Like the chapters are named after the characters that they're following. So it doesn't really give you this omniscience, you know? I sort of think that the synoptic overview of this quasi medieval life world of these characters is granted sort of more as an epiphenomenon of the collection of those individual perspectives. It's not really incarnated in the text itself. And so I think that's kind of a very stark contrast to these old styles. With all that said, I don't know if I could even argue for a return with a V to the third person omniscient kind of point of view. Part of the problem, I think, with this style is that modern people like us find it so difficult to take. It is a lot to take in, I think, when, most people have trouble concentrating on reading in the first place. So with a kind of style that is a very world away, it becomes an even bigger ask for lots of people. But I do, as I was reading Dickens or listening to it, as the case may be, there was a sort of charm to it, like the scope and the bigness of it all. What I like about it is that it can kind of get us out from under ourselves. And for me, I think that's what the best books aim to do by like sort of zooming us out and almost like taking us up to that God's eye view. Not because like, it's not a power kind of fantasy or anything like that. It's more just the ability to sort of range over all of these different experiences, which I think is great. So yeah, that's just something that was on my mind, and I wanted to sort of speak about it. But maybe someone in the audience is trying their hand at writing a book in third person omniscient. I'd be interested to see it when it's published one day, perhaps. But that's it for me today. But just a note that I am about to hit the road. I'm going to be traveling overseas, and I'll be recording a few live episodes from the good old USA. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, have a safe week and consider reading something old in the omniscient third person. Catch you soon.